Now back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
I'll be crying, 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 yeah, crying.
Hey, and welcome back to The Law Show on CL 650. We're talking about family law from McQuarrieHunterLLP in Surrey. We have Leah Donaldson and David Halkett. Now, switching gears a bit more serious now, when you have a situation where you have some kind of abuse in the family, and David, you've talked about this in the past. Abuse is a kind of a overarching term, and it doesn't actually mean just physical abuse, right?
That's true. Most people, that's the easiest one to figure out is the physical abuse. But there's emotional abuse, there's the verbal abuse. We also have economic issues where if you are controlling how your other partner spends the money, that can be abusive. If you're isolating that person from friends, family, etc. So it's a wide range of what constitutes family violence. So when someone comes to visit you, how do you broach that subject? Well, we're required to discuss with them the issues of family violence. Insofar as we have to determine whether or not they can still resolve matters outside of court through alternative dispute resolution. And how the violence affects them in that regard. Because when there's a power imbalance, some people may want to settle an issue simply because they're afraid of their spouse or they feel threatened. And so it's our job to determine where they are on the spectrum of violence and how they can deal with the matters, with the violence kind of being the elephant in the room, so to speak. So what do you do when someone comes in and says, well, my spouse is abusive to me physically? What That's a big red flag that goes off. As their lawyer, what do you say to them?
I would say in that instance that I wouldn't suggest alternative dispute resolution procedures. I would just basically look at it as though, unfortunately, we're in a situation where we're not able to enter into those kind of negotiations. It doesn't mean that you can't, settle the matter, but it should be through letters between counsel rather than getting everyone in a room or going to a mediation. Those kinds of processes shouldn't happen in that instance. That's true. And sometimes we'll have our clients go to a mediator individually and then they come back to us for advice. If there's been violence, especially if there's physical violence, I would never recommend they go by themselves without a lawyer, without me there, or or Leah in her situation, simply because they may agree to stuff that they really shouldn't agree to. But what about just the nuts and bolts of getting out of the house or moving and being away from them? Right. So that it's different than people call it a restraining order often, but it's called a protection order under the Family Law Act. And so we can go into court and seek orders that party have no contact with the spouse. Do people obey these typically? Typically they do. Usually there's a police enforcement clause included in the protection order. So if the person breaches it, they can be arrested. And then it becomes a criminal charge as a result of the breach of the protection order. And so in certain instances, that's important. I would say also I've discussed safety plans with people. So those are not the situations where people just, announce that they're separating and then kind of go about their business. It has to be a plan of where they're going to go, where they're going to stay, sort of setting up bank accounts, having, alternate arrangements for the children, perhaps. So there's a lot of thought and planning that goes into that sort of situation. Yeah. So do you help walk through that with them? We'll tell them what they should be looking to consider doing. And then, of course, they go and they obtain their They put their plan in place themselves. Sometimes that happens. It takes them almost a year to get the plan in place. Sure. Well, that's the old safety first, right? Exactly. The irony of protection orders, of course, is that the people who will abide by them tend to be the people against whom there probably isn't necessary. No piece of paper has ever stopped a knife or a gun or anything, but they certainly are necessary in many cases to, at the very least, cool the situation down. So you're basically saying this is serious now. Exactly. What I also will tell clients who come in and say, look, keep 911 always ready on your speed dial. And if necessary, report the matter to the police because the police can act a lot more quickly than what the civil system works. They can arrest the person on the spot and such. And there's also criminal aspects. The criminal court can grant orders and no contact orders as well when there's charges.
Now, how do you deal with the mental and the financial abuse? So if someone comes to see you and they want to go through with a divorce, but they don't have access to the funds of the family, what do you do?
Well, there are applications you can bring to have funds released. Spousal support's the important one in a case like that, where you have money being paid from one to the other. You can also get disclosure to know exactly what's there, because sometimes the person won't tell the other what is there. So you can bring applications to enforce disclosure rules, and if they're not met, then the person can be fined.
So what kind of lengths do people go to hide money that you've seen? Like, what sort of things do they get up to keep money from their spouse?
I would say it's less common than people think,
Really?
hiding money. I think you have to have a lot of money normally to have these sort of lavish setups where they're hiding, offshore. That doesn't happen in the daily,
But just
bread and butter
cash,
cases.
though.
Cash. So I would say the biggest issue I see is people that are paid in cash, people that work under the table, things like that. They have bank accounts that their spouse doesn't know about. So it's more the regular kind of hiding money.
So how do you find bank accounts that people don't know about?
Well, that is tough. What you can do,
Like, for example, your spouse might have an old bank account in her maiden name, and you might not know about it.
Well, everyone is supposed to swear a Form F8 financial statement in Supreme Court or a Form 4 financial statement in provincial court, where they set out all their assets. So it's assumed because it's a sworn document that is correct. If you think that there's more, you can always get orders to, for whatever bank it may be, that they provide statements for any account under this person's name or this name or whatever, and they are supposed to be provided. If someone really wants to hide money, sometimes it can be very expensive to get to it. And so what we tell our clients is, look, if you think it's going to be worth it financially to spend the money to do the searches through private eyes or whatever, go for it. But it may be that the asset that's being hidden may be $2,000. So you may have spent $3,000 or $4,000 to get a division of $2,000.
Okay, now what about valuing things that people want? Like, somebody says, oh, well, I want that. It's not worth much, but the other person knows that it is. Are most people pretty savvy about what they have in their home?
For the household goods, yes. You can value pensions. We can get an actuary to come in and value and say what the pension is worth. Appraisals for real estate. And for household goods, if you really can't agree, you can bring in appraisals for those as well. And they appraise everything in the home and list what the values are.
Well, I'll just pick something out of the air. Like, say someone's got a stamp collection, and they say, oh, well, it's not worth much. But then you find out later that it's worth a lot more than...
They usually aren't.
I know. I'm just picking that one.
Yeah, no, I know.
I don't know who collects stamps anymore, but somebody out there does.
Yeah, and I actually had to go down to a golden coin once. The person had these old stamps and coins, and the person thought they were worth like 30, 40,000, and the guy says, look, in the condition they are, I'll be lucky to get $2,000 for them.
Really?
Yeah.
So be careful what you ask for.
Exactly.
All right. So back to the situations where you have to divorce. Now, when children are involved and someone comes to you and says, I'm getting a divorce, my spouse is violent, and there's kids in the house, what do you do?
Same thing that I think before, right, Leah?
Yeah, it would be, again, a discussion about how the transition from the home to, because if there's an actual child safety issue, then you obviously have to be extremely careful. So it's a discussion about before you leave the home.
And do you have to, as lawyers, do you have to report it to somebody provincially to say that there's an issue here? You don't?
No.
Because it was there for advice, so it's privileged information.
Of course, yeah.
So it's up to that party. So often clients will report it to the ministry themselves, even though they're the parent. They can report abuse to the ministry. And then there may be orders against the spouse protecting the children as well. So those orders can extend to the children.
I'll just clarify what I said before. If someone says that they have... If we're acting for the person, say, who has been alleged to be abusive, if they say they've abused, we don't have to report them. If they say they're going to, we may have an obligation because there's the society at risk thing. So we may have an obligation there. But for what we're told what happened in the past, we don't have an obligation to report.
So that's when you say, well, you have to have a plan to get out of there.
You do. And that often will be, where are you going to live? Especially with children, it becomes a lot more complicated. So they may be staying with a friend, they may be staying in a motel. And that means, there's also the financial aspect of that. How are you going to live? So often in those cases, I would say a lot of the work, the legal work is done in advance. So we might have to prepare court applications for spousal support on an interim basis and child support. Before the person has even left the home, we have it ready to go to file and serve on that other party, and so that we can get those orders in place to get the funds flowing.
Okay, I'll paint a picture for you. So the person is dominant about who they go and see. They're dominant about how they spend the money. So they're kind of controlling about who their spouse sees, how they spend money. Would those two be enough to impact how much they see their children?
It definitely can be, because
they're not physical. Yeah. They're just controlling. But that could just be seen as a character trait, right? Family
violence is a specific factor in determining child arrangements that the court has to consider. We always looked at it before, but now it's specific, that when determining guardianship, allocation of responsibilities, parenting time, they have to consider the effect of what the violence was and how it affected the children, if they were present, if it's affected them, and that is a factor that goes into the mix.
But as I mentioned, this could just be the person saying, I'm a button-down person, and the other person saying it's abuse.
Yeah. Well, it all depends on how the children were affected. If it was just directed at the spouse, it may not have an effect on the children. But if the children were saw it, if the children suffered in any way, then definitely it's a factor that the court will look at.
Okay. We're going to take a quick break. We're talking about family law from Macquarie LLP. We have David Halkett, partner, and Leah Donaldson, associate in the family law department. And one other lawyer, Sarah Morse, is in your department as well, not here today. We'll continue our conversation next on CL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.